Hey, what is going on guys? RvzStealth here, and in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the champions who deal the least damage per game on average. Now, you guys might be surprised about a few of these champions on this list, but this video is stat based. This is not my opinion. These are actually the champions who on average deal the least damage per game. Now, obviously, there's going to be some games where you deal the most damage in the game with these champions, but it's just the nature of the champion that in some games, if for example you don't get ahead in the early game, you are going to be very weak just because of the champion and their kit. And if you guys have not checked out the video I did on the champions who deal the most damage per game on average, then I will leave an annotation on screen for you guys here in the top right corner, so you can check that out if you would like to. So without any further ado, let's get into the video. So first up here in the top lane at the number 1 spot is Shen. So Shen is one of those top lane champions who pretty much builds full tank. You really don't see many Shen players going damage, and he's also a top lane champion who only has single target damage. He doesn't have one of those strong AoE abilities that he can use in team fights. He's all single target other than his taunt ability, which to be honest doesn't really do any damage at all. So in those team fights, he's just going to be auto attacking to deal most of his damage, and that's not really going to do a whole lot considering he's tank Shen and his autos aren't really going to do that much. So overall, Shen is more of a utility top lane champion. He's mainly played because of his flash taunt ability and because of his global pressure with his ultimate, and not so much because of his damage. The two honorable mentions for top lane are Nautilus and Trundle. So I was a bit surprised that both of these champions did make this list, considering that Trundle usually does go 1 or 2 damage items. You really don't see full tank Trundles. And as for Nautilus, Nautilus can deal decent damage if he does end up getting a Rod of Ages, because he does have the AoE damage from his E, and then his full combo with his Q, E, ultimate can deal quite a bit of damage. But I guess it's because you really don't see too many Nautiluses going for damage. They mainly do build full tank, and therefore he's kind of like Shen. He's just there in team fights for that utility. And then Trundle, he is single target damage only, which is why I think he did make this list. He doesn't deal any AoE damage at all, so I think those are the main reasons to why these champions are at the top for this list. Taking the number 1 spot in the jungle is Nunu. So the main reasons why Nunu does pretty crappy damage is because number 1, he only has 2 damaging abilities. He's only got his E and his ultimate that deal damage. His Q and his W are both utility abilities, and they don't deal damage to champions. And then number 2, if you fall behind with Nunu, then you're pretty useless. You're not going to be able to deal any damage in team fights pretty much, because unless you go full AP Nunu, tank Nunu is not going to deal any damage at all. You're mainly just there in those team fights to peel for your carries, get good ultimates off, and try to stop the enemies from engaging on your back line. The two honorable mentions for the jungle are Skarner and Udyr. So I was a little bit surprised that Skarner made this list, considering he can actually do some decent damage if he does get Trinity Force. I think that the main reason why he's on this list though is because he is only single target damage, and especially if you do fall behind with Skarner, then you're really not going to be able to do too much with the champion. And then pretty much same goes for Udyr. If you fall behind with him, you're pretty damn useless. You're just going to get kited really hard in team fights. You're probably just going to be a stun bot for most of the game, and unless you do get ahead with him, then you're not going to be very successful. Now at the number 1 spot for mid lane is going to be Kale. Now keep in mind guys, all of these mid lane champions do have the potential to deal a lot of damage, and they can top the charts in most damage dealt in some games, but it's the nature of the champion that in some games when you do play them, if you don't do too well in the early game, then you're really not going to deal very much damage, which I think are the main reasons why these 3 champions are on this list. So Kale is one of those mid lane champions who really only does have single target damage. She does have her Q and her E, which are mainly single target. Her E does do a little bit of AoE damage, but if you do fall behind with her, considering that you only do single target and you're not really going to have very many items, then I could see that being why Kale doesn't do as much damage as other mid laners. Now, the two honorable mentions for mid lane are Zillion and Yasuo. So Yasuo, I was a little bit surprised about him being on this list, but I can see where it comes from. Yasuo is one of those champions who can be shut down pretty hard in the early game. Whenever I do see a Yasuo being played, especially in the top lane, they usually end up pushing out in lane, and they just end up dying multiple times to the enemy jungler in the laning phase. They fall behind, and then they become pretty useless. And if you fall behind with Yasuo, you're not really going to be able to deal much damage in team fights. Even if you do get that nice like knock up into your ultimate, you're probably just going to get bursted down right away after that, because you don't have any escapes. If you don't have enough damage to burst down the target you jump onto, then you're not going to be very useful on him. Now, as for Zillion, he only does have one damaging ability, being his Q ability. Now, if you can't hit your double bomb combo on Zillion, then you're not going to deal very much damage at all. His E, his W, and his ultimate are all utility abilities. They all don't do damage, so if you don't lend your Q, then you're not going to top the charts, that's for sure, with Zillion. Taking the number 1 spot for AD carry is really no surprise here, and it's Calista. Calista, the only way that you pretty much win with this AD carry right now is by stomping the early game and hoping that you end the game before the 25 or 30 minute point. Her late game is just so much weaker than a lot of the other AD carries right now. For example, Sivir, Ashe, Vayne, Jhin, they all have better late games than Calista does. So if you don't do well in the early game, then you're really not going to do too well come that mid to late game. Now, the two honorable mentions for AD carry are Vayne and Tristana. So the main reason Vayne is on this list is because her early game is very weak. If you fall behind with Vayne in the early game, then you could just end up getting stomped on really hard, and the game could end before the 25 to 30 minute point, before you do start getting to your items and before you can start dealing a lot of damage in those late game team fights. Now, don't get me wrong, Vayne can deal a load of damage come late game, but it's getting to that late game to enable her to deal that damage. And if you don't have a good early game on her, or if you die a few times in the laning phase, then you're really not going to deal a whole lot of damage with Vayne. And as for Tristana, she is also mainly a late game AD carry champion. She does have a bit of a better early game than Vayne, that's for sure. But if you get shut down in the early game as Tristana, your damage is going to be very, very irrelevant. If you don't end up going even in the laning phase, then it's going to take you until you get to 3 items on Tristana to really start noticing your damage. You need your Infinity Edge, your Runanes, and your Phantom Dancer at least to be able to just start noticing damage in team fights and to be able to carry. And if you fall behind, or if you're stuck on that Infinity Edge Runanes mid game, then you're not going to be very successful on Tristana. At the number 1 spot here to round out the video for support is Janna. So Janna, it's really no surprise here that she is on this list, and the other 2 champions that are on this list, it's really no surprise either. Janna is mainly a peel champion. She's not played for her damage. She's there to keep her AD carry safe and to keep her AD carry alive. She only does have 2 damaging abilities, being her Q and her W, and considering you don't go much AP on Janna, you might build a Magi's and you might get a Frost Queens, but other than that, you're not going to build a whole lot of AP. And considering that her Q and her W don't do a lot of like base damage, and they aren't abilities that you can spam, she's definitely not going to top the charts in damage, especially compared to someone like a Zyra or a Brand or a Vel'Koz support. Now, the 2 honorable mentions for support here are Soraka and Tarik. Now, Soraka is mainly on this list because she only does have 2 damaging abilities like Janna. Her Q and her E they both do a little bit of damage. Like, you can poke decently in the laning phase with Soraka Q, but you're definitely not going to do very much, especially come the mid to late game. And the reason why Tarik is on this list, or Tarik, however you want to pronounce it, is because he only does have that 1 damaging ability, being his E, and his E really doesn't do that much damage at all. He does have the heal with his Q, the shield with his W, and then the invulnerability with his ultimate, so you're really never going to deal much damage as Tarik. You're mainly just there to keep your AD carry safe and to keep your team alive. So that is going to be all for this video, guys. If you did enjoy, then be sure to leave a like, subscribe if you guys have not already, and if you haven't checked out the list I made on the champions who deal the most damage per game, then be sure to check that out. I'll leave an annotation on screen here for you guys. So with that being said, thanks for watching, have an awesome day, and I will see you in my next video.